Chapter 5. She went back to the station on a Tuesday because she couldn't not. The broadcast logs were spread across the floor of her room, above the bait and reel. Kit's copies, meticulous. The handwriting reproduced with a fidelity that suggested Kit's copier was either very good or Kit had traced each page by hand. And Des wasn't ruling out the latter. She'd been reading since the library. She'd been reading through dinner, which was a can of soup heated on the camp stove, and through the night, which was rain and the sound of boats shifting at the dock, and the particular insomnia of a woman whose brain had found a new frequency and refused to let go of it. Harriet's early entries were exactly what Kit had described: professional, precise, the notes of an engineer who documented everything because order was how you kept the world from flying apart. Weather observations, equipment status, transmission logs with timestamps and call signs, and the dry, bureaucratic language of wartime communication. 0743, relayed coastal weather advisory. 1022, received and retransmitted convoy position update. Equipment nominal. Weather, rain. The rain was a constant. Reading the logs was like reading a very specific kind of weather report written by a woman who noticed everything and expressed nothing. The entries had the quality of a fist held tight, controlled, professional, revealing exactly as much as the job required, and not one word more. Des had read the entry about Thomas's ship 3 times now, and each time it hit differently. Not because the words changed, but because she kept hearing new things in them. The way a recording reveals different layers on each listen. The way a piece of music opens up when you know what's coming and can hear the structure underneath the melody. September 15th, 1943. Informed via telegram that USS Cormorant reported missing. Central Pacific. All hands presumed lost. Brother Thomas among crew. Resumed duties. Resumed duties. 2 words that contained an entire cathedral of silence. Des knew that silence. She'd lived inside a version of it. The silence of a person who has lost the thing that organized their world and is holding herself together by doing the next task, and the next one, and the next. Because stopping would mean hearing the noise underneath, and the noise underneath was too loud to survive. She'd closed the logs at 3 in the morning. She'd stared at the ceiling. She'd listened to the rain find its way through the gap in the window frame and thought about a woman in 1943 sitting at a console on a bluff, reading a telegram about her brother and choosing to resume duties. By 9, she was driving up the station road. The building received her the way it always did. The door's announcement, the hallway's linoleum crackle, the smell of ozone and salt, and something underneath both that she still couldn't name. She was starting to think of it as the station smell, the way you think of a person's house as having a specific scent that the person themselves can never detect. She set up in the equipment room. This was deliberate. The broadcast room was where she'd heard the voice, where the voice had said her name, 4 nights ago, in the dark, through equipment that had no power source and no business making sound. She hadn't been back to the broadcast room at night since. She wasn't avoiding it. She was just approaching it from another angle. The way you circle a problem you're not ready to solve. The way a producer works a difficult edit, not head on, but sideways, listening for the thing that will make the rest make sense. The equipment room was cold. It was always cold. Des had brought a fleece and a thermos of coffee that she'd made at the Bait and Reel, with water that tasted like old pipes, and grounds she'd bought at Henderson's. Henderson had looked at the brand, a Portland roaster, the kind that came in a matte black bag with a single origin label, and said nothing, which was Henderson's way of saying everything. She set the thermos on the shelf next to a jar labeled capacitors, 0.01F, in Harriet's sharp handwriting, and the juxtaposition struck her. Portland coffee and 1940s components, 80 years apart, sharing space in a room that was 10 degrees colder than physics could explain. Okay, she said. She talked to herself when she worked. Always had. Marcus used to say it was like living with a podcast host who never turned off, which was funny until it wasn't, which was around the time everything else about them stopped being funny too. Okay, let's see what you do. She pulled her notebook from her bag and sat down on the wooden chair in front of the receiver. The chair was solid, hand-built like the table, the same carpenter, she guessed, someone who cared about joints and grain direction. It was the kind of chair that wanted you to stay. She'd sat in production chairs for years, the ergonomic mesh things that adjusted 17 ways and never felt right. The secondary receiver sat in front of her like a question. She'd touched the copper coils on her first visit and felt the hum, that low, patient frequency that lived in the pads of her fingers. She'd touched them again on subsequent visits, and the hum had been there each time, steady, as if the equipment were running a process she couldn't see and didn't want to interrupt. She'd documented it. She'd recorded it on her Zoom, or tried to. The recording showed a flat waveform where her ears heard sound, which was either an equipment malfunction or evidence of something her microphones weren't built to capture. Today, she was going further. She placed her fingertips on the nearest coil. The hum arrived, familiar now, the low greeting of a system acknowledging her presence. She let it settle into her hands, into her wrists, into the specific resonance it found in her chest, right behind her sternum, where anxiety lived, and where this particular frequency had decided to make itself at home. Recording, she said, and pressed the button on the Zoom F6 she positioned on the table. October 7th, equipment room, contact with secondary receiver. Attempt. She checked her notebook. Attempt number 8. Time is 10:14 a.m. Ambient temperature approximately 45 degrees. External conditions: overcast, wind southwest, 12 to 15. Tower pitch consistent with previous visits. She turned the first dial. The hum shifted, dropped a half step, maybe less. The kind of interval you'd miss if you weren't trained to hear it, if your ears hadn't spent 8 years pulling voices out of noise floors and frequencies out of static. Des was trained. She heard it. She turned the dial another fraction of an inch, and the hum shifted again. And this time, something else happened. The static in the room changed. It was subtle. The equipment room had its own noise floor. The building's ambient sounds, the tower's vibration conducted through concrete, the coastal wind finding gaps in the walls. That noise floor was usually steady, a whitish hiss with the low-frequency warmth of a building that sat on basalt bedrock. What changed was not the volume, but the texture. The static developed grain. It went from smooth to, she searched for the right word, woven, as if the randomness were organizing itself into something, the way sand on a vibrating plate forms patterns at specific frequencies. She turned the dial again. The patterns intensified. The static was doing something she recognized from years of post-production work. It was clearing. The noise floor was lowering itself, making room, the way a crowd goes quiet when someone is about to speak. And underneath the clearing static, faint but undeniable, she could hear edges. Not the voice, not yet. Just the edges of something. The sonic equivalent of seeing a shape in fog. Movement where there shouldn't be movement. Structure where there should be randomness. The ghost of a signal resolving beneath the noise. She adjusted a second dial, this one smaller, mounted to the left of the main tuner, with a resistance that suggested it hadn't been turned in decades and didn't appreciate being turned now. It gave under her fingers with a reluctance that was almost physical, almost personal, as if the equipment had opinions about who was allowed to make adjustments and was withholding judgment until it saw what she did next. The second dial controls something, she said into the recorder. Resistance is significant. The mechanism is physical, not corroded. Someone designed this to require intentional force. You can't accidentally turn this dial. You have to mean it." She meant it. The dial turned. The static shifted again, not just in texture now, but in spatial quality. The sound moved. It went from flat, two-dimensional noise to something with depth, with dimension, as if the room had suddenly acquired acoustic properties it hadn't had before. The static was behind her and above her and in the floor, and it was layered. She could hear layers in it, the way you hear layers in an orchestra warming up, each instrument occupying its own frequency band, each voice preparing to play its part. Dez's hands were trembling. She noticed this with the clinical detachment of a woman who had spent the last 10 days experiencing impossible things and had developed a protocol for managing her response. Notice, document, continue. Do not stop. Do not question the premise. You are a producer. You are documenting a phenomenon. The phenomenon does not require your belief. It requires your attention. She gave it her attention. She gave it everything. The fragments came. They arrived the way the voice had arrived 4 nights ago, riding the static, emerging from it like a figure stepping out of rain. But these were not a single voice. These were pieces. A word here, a phrase there, the conversational shrapnel of what sounded like multiple people speaking at once, at different distances, on different frequencies, none of them quite reaching her clearly, but all of them reaching. She caught the edge of a sentence, female voice, unfamiliar accent, saying something that ended with, "The boundary is." She caught a single word, male voice, deep, almost subsonic. Listen. She caught what might have been laughter, or might have been static that had organized itself into something that sounded enough like laughter to make the hair on her arm stand up. She caught a phrase in a language she didn't recognize. Not the sound of the words, but the rhythm, the cadence, a syntax that her brain couldn't parse, but that her body responded to, with a shiver that started at the base of her skull and traveled down her spine like a finger tracing vertebrae. She turned the first dial back, gently. The fragments receded. She turned it forward. They returned. Back, gone. Forward, there. "The receiver is tunable," she said into the Zoom, and her voice was shaking, and she didn't care. "The signal is consistent. It responds to dial position. I can attenuate and amplify by, it's not volume, it's not gain. It's," she searched for the word and found it in the place she always found the right words, which was in the space between technical language and the truth. "It's like opening a window. The signal is on the other side, and the dial controls how far the window opens." She sat with the receiver for 3 hours. By the end, her notebook was full. She documented 7 distinct vocal fragments, 3 episodes of the organized emotion sound that had no words but communicated feeling directly. One that felt like grief, one that felt like urgency, one that she could only describe as recognition, the sensation of being seen by something she couldn't see. She'd mapped the 2 dials to approximate frequency ranges, though the ranges didn't correspond to any broadcast band she knew. She'd noted that the signal strength varied with no apparent external cause, stronger at some moments, weaker at others, as if the source were moving or breathing or alive. She'd also noted, in handwriting that got smaller and less steady as the morning progressed, that the equipment responded differently when she was focused. When her attention wandered, when she thought about the logs, or the coffee getting cold, or the specific shape of Kit's hands on the broadcast logs yesterday, the signal weakened. When she was fully present, fully listening, it strengthened. The receiver didn't just respond to physical adjustment, it responded to her. She wrote, "It knows when I'm paying attention." She underlined it. Then she crossed out the underlining, because underlining felt like the first step toward the kind of certainty that got people called crazy. Then she underlined it again, because pretending she hadn't noticed wasn't going to help anyone. She was packing up the recorder at 1:30 when it happened. She'd been reaching across the receiver to unplug the Zoom's output cable, her hand passing over the copper coils, and her fingertips grazed the top of the resonance circuit, the junction where the coils met the cable that ran through the wall to the main console. She'd touched this spot before. It was warm, always warm, the thermal anomaly that was apparently the station's calling card. But this time, when she touched it, the warmth didn't stay in her fingers. It traveled up her arm, through her shoulder, into the center of her chest. Not painful, not even uncomfortable, just warm, the way sunlight is warm when it finds you through a window in winter, specific and directional and aimed. And with the warmth came something else, a sensation she had no framework for, no vocabulary, no professional protocol. It was like hearing a song she'd forgotten she knew. It was like walking into a room she'd never been in and recognizing the smell. She saw, no. She didn't see, sight wasn't the right sense. She experienced, for a duration that was probably 2 seconds and felt like a full minute, the following: a woman's hands, not her hands, broader, stronger, the nails cut blunt, the right forearm carrying a scar, copper patina on the fingertips. The hands were holding something, a piece of paper, cream colored, folded once. The paper trembled. The hands were steady, but the paper trembled, and the contradiction between the steady hands and the trembling paper contained an entire vocabulary of grief. The body controlling what the world couldn't. The hands holding steady, because if the hands let go, everything let go. The room was the same room, the equipment room, but the light was different, warmer, more golden, angled from a window that wasn't boarded over yet. The smell was different, wool and solder flux, and something baking somewhere far below, which was impossible because the station didn't have a kitchen and never had. But the smell was there. Bread. Someone, somewhere, was baking bread, and the smell of it was drifting up the bluff. And the woman with the steady hands and the trembling paper was breathing it in, because it was the last ordinary thing she would breathe for a very long time. Then the sound of a console humming. The same hum, the same frequency, the same patient, steady note that Des heard every time she entered this building. But in this experience, memory, whatever it was, the hum was new. The hum was just beginning. The woman at the console was hearing it for the first time, and her reaction was not fear or wonder, but recognition, as if she'd always known the building could make this sound and had been waiting for it to start. Then it was gone. Des was standing in the equipment room, her hand on the junction of the resonance circuit, her body tilted at the listening angle, the one Marcus had photographed, the dog hearing a whistle posture she couldn't control, and her eyes were wet, which was wrong, because she hadn't been crying. She hadn't been feeling anything, not consciously, not in the way that produces tears. But her eyes were wet, and her chest ached with a grief that wasn't hers, a specific and enormous grief that belonged to a woman who had stood in this exact spot 82 years ago and read a piece of paper that changed the frequency of her entire life. Harriet, Des said. The name came out like a breath, like something she'd been holding. The station hummed. Same note, same patience. Des pulled her hand from the junction. The warmth receded, traveling back down her arm, draining from her chest, leaving her standing in a cold room with a fast pulse and a full recorder, and the absolute, unshakable certainty that the building had just shown her something. Not a ghost, not a hallucination, a memory. The station's memory, or Harriet's memory, stored in the station's equipment, or something else entirely that Des didn't have words for, because the English language had not evolved to describe the experience of touching a copper coil and feeling a dead woman's hands. She sat down in the wooden chair. Okay, 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 she whispered. The self-soothing repetition, the one that meant her brain was running too fast for her mouth. She pressed her palms against the arms of the chair and felt the wood, solid, specific, real. The grain under her fingers, the slight give of the joinery. A chair built by someone who knew what they were doing, 80 years ago, for a woman who would sit in it while the world came apart, and the equipment came alive, and the voices started speaking. The thought arrived fully formed, and she examined it the way she examined all her thoughts lately, from a slight distance, with the clinical attention of a woman who was no longer sure which of her impulses were her own and which were the station's. She should call Kit. Kit would know if this was. Kit would understand. Kit had heard the voice when they were 9, had pressed their ear against the locked door, and heard what Des was hearing now. And Kit had carried that hearing for 28 years. And Kit was the only person within 100 miles who wouldn't think she was losing it. But calling Kit meant saying it out loud. Calling Kit meant translating the experience into language, and language would flatten it, would reduce it to a story about touching some wires and having a weird sensory experience. And it wasn't that. It was bigger than that. It was the most intimate thing that had ever happened to her inside a building. And she'd been married to her work inside buildings for 8 years. And this was different. She reached for the thermos instead, poured coffee into the cap, drank it. It was cold now, and it tasted like Portland and old pipes and the specific comfort of a ritual performed in a place that was anything but comfortable. She picked up her notebook and turned to a fresh page. October 7th, 1:34 p.m. Contact with resonant circuit junction produced sensory experience. Duration approximately 2 seconds. Content: visual, tactile impression of female hands holding paper. Emotional content: grief. Setting consistent with equipment room circa 1940s. Impression of bread smell, external, from below station. No auditory hallucination. The station's ambient hum was present in the experience, suggesting temporal overlay rather than imagination. She paused, looked at what she'd written, looked at the receiver, sitting on its handmade table, the copper coils catching the thin October light from the hallway. Assessment: the station is showing me Harriet. She wrote it. She didn't cross it out. She sat in the chair for another 20 minutes, drinking cold coffee, listening to the building breathe around her, the towers hum, the hallways creak, the fire door adjusting in its frame, like a person shifting their weight. The fragments she'd heard through the receiver that morning were still in her ears, layered over the station's ambient sounds, like a double exposure. This reality, and whatever was on the other side of the dials, existing simultaneously, separated by nothing more than a turn of a knob and the width of a woman's attention. She packed up her gear. She walked through the hallway, the linoleum crackling its adhesive hello beneath her boots. She paused at the broadcast room door and looked in at the console, the desk, the 2 coffee cups. Harriet's old ceramic, stained with 70 years of tea and tannin, and Dez's own travel mug, set beside it 3 days ago without thinking, the way you set your things down next to someone you've decided to stay near. She hadn't decided. She hadn't decided anything. She was a woman standing in a doorway between 2 rooms in a building she'd bought at auction, because her life had fallen apart, and the listing price was low enough to be either a bargain or a warning. The console's brass knob caught the afternoon light, late, gold, theatrical. The kind of light the building seemed to conjure when it wanted to remind you it was beautiful. The knob was warm. She could feel it from the doorway, which was impossible, which was the station's default setting. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. Not to the console, not to Harriet, to the room, which was the same thing. She drove down the station road in the fading light. The tower disappeared behind her piece by piece. First the top, lost in the low clouds that were already building toward the next rain. Then the lattice. Then the concrete pad. Then nothing. Just trees and gravel and the certainty growing in her like a signal strengthening that she had touched something today that was not finished with her. At the bait and reel, she sat on her bed and opened the broadcast logs to the page she'd bookmarked. October 1943, a month after the telegram. Harriet's handwriting, sharper now, the letters smaller, pressed harder into the page, as if the pen were working through something the words couldn't carry. October 22nd, 1943. Began modifications to secondary receiver. If the signal exists, I will find it. If the signal does not exist, I will have built something beautiful for no reason, which is still better than sitting here not building anything. Des read the entry twice. She read it a third time, slowly, hearing each word the way she heard audio. Not just the content, but the rhythm, the pacing, the specific silence between beautiful and for no reason that held everything Harriet was not saying. She thought about the hands she'd seen, felt, experienced, the steady hands and the trembling paper, the grief that wasn't hers and had for 2 seconds been entirely hers. She picked up her phone. She opened Kit's contact, entered yesterday at the library when Kit had written their number on a slip of archival paper with a pencil that probably cost more than Dez's car radio. She typed, "I went to the station today. The equipment did something new. Can we talk?" She stared at the message. She hit send before she could change her mind. Kit's reply came 4 minutes later. The 4 minutes felt significant, long enough that Kit had read the message, considered it, and composed a response with characteristic care. Short enough that the response had been urgent. "Yes, library opens at 9, or I can come to the station." Des typed back, "Station, tomorrow. Bring the logs, the 1943 ones." A pause. Then, "I always bring the logs." And under that, a beat later, the thing Kit almost never did, a second message, unplanned, the cracks showing. "Des, what did you hear?" She looked at the question. She thought about the hands, the bread, the hum that was new to Harriet and old to her, and the same frequency in both cases. Patient, patient, patient. "I didn't hear anything," she typed. "I think the station showed me something. I don't know how to explain it yet. Tomorrow." Kit's reply was one word. Tomorrow. Des set the phone on the bed. She pulled the broadcast logs toward her and found the next page, October 1943, and she read until the rain outside the window matched the rain in Harriet's entries, and the distance between 1943 and now collapsed to the width of a page, the width of a signal, the width of a woman's grief, carrying across 80 years of static like a voice calling through a wall that was thinner than anyone knew.